This week we're going to go about as far back as we can go in the history of congregational song, and that is the music of the Bible. But by far the biggest collection of songs in the Hebrew Bible is the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms contains 150 different psalms or hymns. These were the hymns of ancient Israel. The Psalter served as the hymnal of the temple, and then later of the synagogue, and then after that of the early church. And by the way, just as a quick aside, each one of the psalms in the book of Psalms is a psalm. It's not a psalms. If you're reading from a psalm, you're reading from a psalm. It's not like you're reading Romans 3. That's the letter to the Romans. It's not like there was some group of people called the Psalms, and this is the letter to the Psalms, right? So it's Psalm 23. It's not Psalms 23. Right? I saw it on a bumper sticker the other day. It was like Psalms 119. Like, Psalm 119 is long enough by itself. Please don't make it plural. So it's Psalm 23 because it's the 23rd Psalm. Okay, it's Psalm number 23 out of this collection of 150 separate Psalms. Each one is a psalm. Make sense? Okay. All right. So he said the book of Psalms was the hymnal of ancient Israel. It was the hymnal of the temple. It was the hymnal of the synagogue. It was the hymnal of the early church. Now, the singing of psalms became highly specialized and stylized, though, and by the Middle Ages, only people who were well trained in singing the psalms could sing them in worship, and they did not sing them in the vernacular. They sang them in Latin, and it was something that only the priests did, or monks did, because they were the only ones who had the time to learn how. Reformers, such as Martin Luther and John Calvin, found different ways to restore the singing of the psalms to the congregation. Here's what Luther had to say about the singing of psalms. He said, "Where does one find finer words of joy than in the psalms of praise and thanksgiving? On the other hand, where do you find deeper, more sorrowful, more pitiful words of sadness than in the psalms of lamentation, or what we might call the psalms of lament, the penitential psalms? So too, when they speak of fear and hope, they use such words that no painter could depict for your fear and hope, and no Cicero or other orator so portray them." And here's what John Calvin had to say about the singing of psalms. He said, "I may truly call this book, the book of Psalms, an anatomy of all the parts of the soul. For no one can feel a movement of the Spirit which is not reflected in this mirror. All the sorrows, fears, troubles, doubts, hopes, pains, perplexities, stormy outbreaks by which the hearts of men are tossed have been here depicted by the Holy Spirit to the very life." So, within the Psalms, we just have a microcosm of human experience. The Psalms speak to everything that you and I can experience as human beings, whether it's our joys or our sorrows or anything in between. I don't think I can emphasize the importance of this enough, and that is that the Psalms are meant to be sung. Thinking of the Psalms as scripture readings alone does violence to their character and to the reason they were written. The Psalms are sung. They were sung as part of the worship at the temple. They were sung as part of the worship of the synagogue. They were sung as part of the worship of the ancient church, the medieval church, the Reformation era church, both Catholic and Protestant, and remained the musical foundation of church music until relatively recently in church history. When we cut ourselves off from psalm singing, we cut ourselves off not only from our history as the people of God, but from our theology as well. We ignore psalm singing to our own great detriment. So let's get to talking about how to sing the Psalms. The book of Psalms is intended to be sung, not simply read. That is a given by now, but how have people sung the Psalms. Number of different ways people have sung psalms over the centuries. The first one we look at is plain song, also known as plain chant. Chant is monophonic. That is to say, it's all in unison. It's all unaccompanied. Chant does not use the major and minor scales as we know them today. Instead, it uses 8 psalm tones or 8 what we call church modes, which have a different character to them from our major and minor scales. The different psalm tones, the different chant tones that we have go back to antiquity, to the early church, and possibly even earlier than that, possibly even to the synagogue. We'll look at plain chant or plain song more in a moment. There's Anglican chant. Anglican chant is a harmonized form of chant. The melody itself is a lot simpler than that of plain song, but the main feature is the fact that it is sung in harmony, 4-part harmony, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, rather than all in unison. And we'll look at an example of this one in a minute too. The next I have are the Gelano Psalms, also called the Grail Psalms. These were developed in the early 50s, that's the 1950s, by a Jesuit priest named Joseph Gelano, which is why we call them Gelano Psalms. They were published by the Ladies of the Grail, which is why we call them also the Grail Psalms. They're responsorial, which is to say the verses of the psalms themselves would be sung by a cantor or by a choir, and the congregation sings a refrain. And in psalmody and psalm singing, we call that an antiphon, which simply comes from a word that means to sing back. Antiphon, phone like telephone, antiphon, to sing back. So the cantor or the choir sings 3 or 4 verses of the psalm, and then the congregation sings back to the cantor or to the choir the antiphon. That structure is used a lot in plain song too, where you have a cantor or a choir chant several verses of the psalm, and then the congregation will chant an antiphon. But the difference is, in the Gelano Psalms, the melodies have a regular meter or beat to them. So that's more like music that we're more used to hearing and music that we're more used to singing together. The next one builds on this foundation laid for us by the Gelano Psalms, and that's been given the name Presbyterian chant. The main reason it's been given that name is because it was invented by Hal Hobson. And Hal Hobson was a great Presbyterian composer and member, active in Presbyterian Association of Musicians and the Hymn Society, and just sort of a hero of church music in the Presbyterian Church. And he invented this stuff, and so we often call it Presbyterian chant. By the way, any music directors who might be listening, watching, if you do not have Hal Hobson's 2 books, Holy is the Lord and the Psalter, Psalms and Canticles for Singing, you need to get them right now. Holy is the Lord, Music for the Lord's Day, Music for Lord's Day Worship, Hal Hobson, Geneva Press, 2002. And the Psalter, Psalms and Canticles for Singing, Hal Hobson, Westminster John Knox Press, 1993. When the archive comes out, you can just run it back and get that, and I'll try to email the information to you tonight. You need those books. If you are interested in revitalizing the singing of psalms in your congregation, you need Hal Hobson in your life. All right, so Presbyterian chant is sort of a cross between the Gelano Psalms and traditional plain song. Gelano uses music with a regular beat, but does not paraphrase the psalms themselves to be metrical. They're not metered like a hymn would be. And so depending on which verse of the psalms you're singing, when you go back through the tune another time, you have to fit like different numbers of syllables into the tune on each pass, and it can get a little confusing. Hobson's Presbyterian chant is accompanied, like the Gelano Psalms, usually accompanied by the piano or the organ, but it's free like plain song. There's no set beat that you have to force the syllables into. You take the time that you need to sing the words that you need to sing. And like the Gelano Psalms, it's typically done with a cantor or choir singing the verses and the congregation singing an antiphon between sets of verses. And the next one is metrical psalms. These originated during the Reformation period. Both streams of the early Reformation, the Lutheran stream and the Reformed stream, wanted to recover congregational singing. As we said, singing in the church had become professionalized with only priests or monks doing it. Music had become complex so that the average person could not participate even if they wanted to. But they weren't invited to. They watched and they listened. It's very similar to what happens in thousands of churches every Sunday today. Worship had become passive. It had become a spectator sport. And the Lutherans and the Reformed leaders solved this problem in different ways. In the Lutheran tradition, the solution was chorales. Chorales were 4-part hymns, many of them based on ancient chant melodies and settings of the texts of the ancient chants, including the Psalms. And they were in the vernacular, so in this case in German. In the Reformed tradition, the solution was in introducing metrical psalms. A metrical psalm is a psalm that has been paraphrased so that it has a regular meter like hymns do, and usually so that it rhymes. We can break this down further. There was the Genevan Psalter. John Calvin, we read that quote from him earlier, believed that there were no better songs for worship than the biblical Psalms. And it just so happens that at this same time, the Renaissance poet Clement Marot, who was the court poet for the King of France, was making a splash with his collection of the biblical Psalms translated into French and paraphrased to be metrical so they could be sung to Renaissance troubadour-style tunes. I am not making this up. They were sung. They were a hit. This was like the new fashion. They were sung at the royal courts, at the noble courts, and sung in the streets of Paris, and they were extremely popular. And Calvin made these poems by Marot, set to Renaissance, sort of dancey Renaissance feeling tunes, the basis of the worship of the Reformed Church in Geneva. Marot didn't just do psalms, he also did versions of many of the New Testament canticles, like the Nunc Dimittis. Later, Calvin's associate in Geneva, Theodore de Bèze, added to Marot's collection until it contained all 150 psalms and many New Testament canticles as well. This collection, along with tunes written by Renaissance composers like Louis Bourgeois and Claude Goudamel, is known as the Genevan Psalter. The Genevan Psalter was a major influence on the next collection, which is the Scottish Psalter. John Knox, the Scottish reformer, spent much time in Geneva, where he studied with Calvin and preached to the English-speaking congregation there, known as the Marian Exiles, because they had fled to Geneva to escape from Mary Tudor. While there, he also experienced worship that featured the singing of the Genevan Psalter. While Knox was in Geneva, he oversaw the production of an English-language version of the Genevan Psalter, which was called the Anglo-Genevan Psalter. It contained 51 psalms, and it was later supplemented by English versions of the rest of the psalms, and it formed the basis for the first edition of the Scottish Psalter. Scottish Psalter went through many different revisions and more editions throughout the years. The Westminster Assembly, which produced the Westminster Confession of Faith, and the Westminster Larger and Shorter Catechisms also produced a metrical psalter, which has become the definitive English language psalter. It's now known as the Scottish Psalter of 1650. The Church of Scotland and Presbyterianism in general were exclusive psalmodists, meaning they sang only psalms and a few canticles for worship for centuries. In fact, in the Church of Scotland, congregations didn't sing hymns other than the psalms and canticles of the Bible until the mid-19th century. And the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland did not produce a church hymnary until 1898, which is relatively recent, given 2,000 years of church history. 1898 is relatively recent. There's one other stream of psalmody we should mention, and that is the psalm paraphrases of Isaac Watts. Tim mentioned Isaac Watts being well represented in the Chalice hymnal. Watts was not a Presbyterian. Watts was a congregational minister in England. But the Congregationalists had been greatly influenced not only by the Scots Presbyterians, but also by the English Puritans, both of whom were exclusive psalmists. In other words, they only sang the Psalms. So Watts grew up in the Congregational churches, grew up singing the metrical Psalms in worship, and he found them lacking in that the church never got to sing in praise of Christ. So Watts set about to produce paraphrases of the Psalms that introduce ideas and images of Jesus Christ into them. His collection of these, called The Psalms of David Imitated, was first published in 1719. It contains his paraphrase of Psalm 98, which we now know as Joy to the World, his paraphrase of Psalm 72, which we now know as Jesus Shall Reign, and many more. And so Watts' collection, called The Psalms of David Imitated, did much to introduce hymnody into the Reformed family of churches. So the Scots Presbyterians, the English Puritans, the Congregationalists became acquainted with hymnody largely because of Watts. All right, now here is just a little bit of Psalm 23 from the Plain Song Psalter, so you can see what it looks like. I'm going to chant the psalm in just a second. I've just got the first 3 verses up here for you, so you can see it. I will chant all 6 verses, though, in just a moment. And if you compare this, what's up on the screen, with the text of the Psalter in the Book of Common Prayer, you'll see that they are identical. So with plain song, we can take the Psalms just as they are, out of whatever translation of the Bible we want to use, and sing them. We don't have to paraphrase them. We don't have to put them into meter to make them fit with hymn tunes. We don't have to try to make them rhyme. We can just open up the Bible, so to speak, and sing them. Now, one thing that we do have to do, and you notice that the text is pointed. There are markings in the text that correspond to the markings in the music. So we have those little accent marks, and those correspond to the accents in the text. And then we have a preparatory. The little slash is a preparatory mark that tells us we're approaching the final cadence. You notice here that the first 2 words of the psalm are in italics. Now this is called the intonation or the incipit. The first 2 notes in the chant go with these 2 words, or if it's a longer word, it's the first 2 syllables, whatever the first 2 syllables are in the psalm. This happens at the beginning of the chant and any time after the singing of the antiphon. The antiphon is like a refrain, and on shorter psalms, you typically only do that at the beginning and the end. In longer psalms, you may sing the antiphon at certain points in between. It's indicated in the text of the Psalter. And if there is an antiphon somewhere in the middle, when you come back out of the antiphon and you go back into the psalm text, you go back and you sing the first 2 one-syllable words, or the first 2 syllables on the incipit again. Otherwise, as you go along chanting the subsequent verses, you just start right on that long rectangular note that's called a lozenge, and that is the reciting tone. And so the subsequent verses would just start on the reciting tone. The purpose of the incipit is to set the tone. That's where we get that term, that expression. We say things like, oh, he really set the tone for the rest of the meeting. That comes from chant. The person who sings the intonation or the incipit is literally setting the tone, the psalm tone, for everyone else to sing. Now, typically a cantor or a choir would chant the verses of the psalm with the congregation chanting the antiphon. And like I said, antiphon is just like a refrain, and there are different antiphons for the different seasons. So if you're singing a psalm during Lent, it would have one antiphon. If it's during Christmas tide, for example, it would have a different antiphon. During the Great 50 Days of Easter, it would have a different antiphon. So those antiphons change seasonally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to chant this Psalm 23, and I'll ask you to sing the antiphon. I'll indicate by raising my hand, and the antiphon will appear at the bottom of your screen during those times. We're going to start by, I'll sing the antiphon by myself first, and then I'll invite you to join in. Then I'll chant Psalm 23, and it's not indicated to have the antiphon in the middle, but we're going to insert it after verse 4, just so you can see what it's like to sing that incipit again coming out of the antiphon. So we'll sing the antiphon at the beginning. I'll sing it first, then I'll invite you to join me on it. Then we'll sing it together after verse 4, and then we'll sing it together again at the end of the psalm. And I'm going to sing the antiphon. So here's the antiphon. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. He revives my soul and guides me along right pathways for his name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. You spread a table before me in the presence of those who trouble me. You have anointed my head with oil, and my cup is running over. Surely your goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. So that's plain song.